Good morning guys. Today I wanted to share my top 10 watercolor tips that will drastically improve your art. Hey, I'm Chantal. I'm a watercolor artist and illustrator. You might know me from painting my really big watercolor paintings for my children's book Adina and Her Star, which is releasing early 2026. But I actually only started painting watercolor 3 years ago, and I was able to take my art from this to this. And so all the things that I have learned over the last 3 years, I wanted to share with you today so you can practice and strengthen and evolve your own watercolor skills, because I think watercolor is, I may be a little biased, but such a beautiful medium that you can do so much with. So before we get into the tips of watercolor, let's talk a little bit about why we love watercolor. For me, watercolor is such a powerful medium. It's kind of like this evolving paradox where you can use it very lightly with big brush strokes, and you can let it do organic things that you have no control over. But you can also use watercolor in this beautiful, very controlled way where you control the watercolor where it runs and build up layers to paint a very sophisticated portrait or piece. And so the paradox and the contrast between these two aspects of watercolor can lead you to paint something that is so magical and sophisticated. And I think that is what is so beautiful and so powerful with this medium watercolor, is that you can do so much with it. This versatility of this medium means that you can take watercolor to ways and heights that you could never imagine and that I could never imagine. For me, I like to push the boundaries of watercolor beyond what it is conventionally seen as, because I think in the art world, a lot of watercolor is used in this very free-flowing way, and I really like to push it in a way that is more controlled. And how far can I control watercolor to produce something that is almost realistic and that you would only expect from a oil painting? And can I do that with watercolor? Can I push what people think watercolor is capable of? And I think that gives me so much dopamine and so much happiness, and also so much power in my own craft and where I can bring my art in the future. I actually started practicing watercolor before I learned anatomy or color theory or any of the design elements. I was practicing watercolor every single day in order to be able to waterbend. And I also designed specifically a coloring in book that allows you guys to practice your own watercolor techniques and practice your own skills without worrying about anatomy or composition. So today I am going to paint one of my pieces in my coloring in book and talk about my top 10 tips for watercolor. So let's dive straight into the painting. My first watercolor tip would be to understand your materials. Every single brand and type of watercolor paper is going to behave differently, is going to soak up the water at a different rate and let the watercolors bleed differently. And so by practicing a lot on different types of paper, you're going to understand how watercolor moves and how much color it holds. Same goes for your paints. Professional watercolors are going to be a lot different than student grade because they hold a lot more pigment. Same with brushes. Different brushes will hold different amounts of water. So if you're starting to paint with watercolor for the first time, I suggest getting a really good brush that holds a lot of water. Otherwise, you're going to struggle to move water across the page. My second tip with watercolor is to understand your colors, and this is where color theory comes into play. In order to build transparent layers, you're going to have to understand how the layers of color interact and build on one another when you're layering with watercolor. And so this takes a lot of time, a lot of practice. For me, I really accelerated my understanding of color. When building portraits, I primarily use the colors of raw sienna, 2 different types of red, and an ultramarine blue to build up and scale any type of portrait, and then I'll add in different colors depending on the skin color. My third tip, painting with watercolor is probably the most important tip that you will ever hear, and that is waiting for each layer to dry before moving on to the next. So I did a complete flat wash of the girl's face, and I waited for that to completely dry before I'm building in my shadows and my midtones around her nose, her eye, and the side of her face. Now it's really important to wait for each layer to dry before you move on to the next, because if you don't, you're going to go and lift off the previous watercolor layer. It's going to bleed into one another, and you're not going to get a really nice gradual and beautiful gradient across those shadows. If you don't wait, you get something what I like to call is onions, and onions are not very pretty. They actually make me cry, quite literally, and looking at the portrait when you don't have nice skin tones makes me want to cry as well. So really be patient and wait for every layer to dry. A face for me can have 10 to 20 layers, and sometimes I just want to rush and finish it, but I have to remember that I have to wait for each layer to dry. Tip number 5 is control your water usage. The less brush strokes you need in order to achieve your goal, the better, because the more brush strokes we need to use on the page, the more likely that our colors will get muddy or will lift off the previous layer. So really control your water usage by picking out brushes that will suit your need. If I'm going over a large area of the face, I'll use a bigger brush, while if I'm working on smaller details and just the shadows, I will use a much smaller brush. And this allows me to control my water usage, so I'm not using too much water and muddying the colors. Tip number 6 is pre-mix your colors. This is so important because at times I will have a color on my brush, put it on the page and be like, oh my god, that is not the color I wanted. So it's so important to pre-mix your colors and test them out before you dive in and put them on the page. And tip number 7 closely follows tip number 6, and that is to mix more of the color you need than what you expect. At times, we'll mix a little bit of watercolor on our pan, go in to paint the area and realize we've run out of that color. Now, making up that exact same color is a lot more difficult than if you were working with oil paints or acrylic, because you're using water as a medium to carry the pigment. And so always remember to make more color than you think you will need. Paint darker than what you would expect. When we're using watercolor and we're painting wet straight onto the paper, it's going to appear a lot darker than what it dries as. So watercolor dries lighter. And so what you originally may have thought is a dark color will actually dry a lot lighter. So always paint darker in areas that you want to be really dark than what you would expect. Tip number 9 is always work light to dark. Once you put watercolor on the page, it is almost impossible to get back off. If I'm painting these little raspberries right now, this is the lightest that they will ever be. And from there, I'm working in my shadows and adding depth to the little raspberry balls. And so really think about, before you commit watercolor to the paper, remember that this shade you're currently going to put on the paper is the lightest it will ever be. And from there, you add the shadows and you add the darkness. Now, this is the opposite of oil or acrylic, so you kind of have to think a little bit backwards and be very mindful with how you're going to build up layers. Tip number 10, my very last tip when painting with watercolor, is to add diversity in your techniques. A lot of watercolor paintings will work with wet on wet or wet on dry, but for me, I really like to add contrast between the realism of the portrait and the whimsical nature of the background. So while I used wet on dry for the portrait and the little details in the background, I'm going to use a wet on wet technique to add contrast and for the focal points of the birds in the portrait to stand out. And so what I'm doing is I'm painting the entire background wet first, and then on top I'm adding little bleeds with different types of greens and pinks. And so this beautiful contrast makes a magical painting. I hope you guys found these tips really helpful. In the end, this portrait took me around 3 hours if I was to count all the times I took a break and waited for the watercolor to dry. If you would like to practice your own techniques and would like to buy my watercolor coloring in book, it is linked in the description. I will see you very soon for the 6th episode of Adina Hunter Star. Love you!